Before we end this, I just want to switch subjects, and I want to touch about the subject of ISIS, Jim. Mm-hmm. How is it possible that a group basically unknown 2 years prior comes up with that much funding, structure, and placement without some sort of outside assistance? Can you share your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the outside assistance came from Langley. ISIS actually is a creation of Western intelligence organizations. And unfortunately, whether they did it knowingly or unknowingly, the end result was they created a fairly potent force that's well-equipped and decently trained, not superbly trained, but decently trained, trained well enough to put our allies like the Iraqi government scurrying for cover. You know, in one case, they had a city in Iraq that had 30,000 government troops and something like only somewhere between 800 and 2,000 ISIS troops attacked, and the government troops fled. Pretty ridiculous situation. I do think that ISIS was indeed created by our own intelligence organizations, and whether they did it just to counter the Assad government of Syria and didn't really realize what they were creating remains to be seen. But we've got to live with it now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. James, one of the biggest misunderstandings I hear from the folks mentioning the so-called inevitable war to come is the following. Not many understand the fact that in this next conflict, the U.S. is hosting home field, and in this case, I don't think it's an advantage. Much of the conflict will be on U.S. turf. This next war isn't going to be watched from somebody's TV screen with a cold beer. This time, it's coming to that turf and in the form of small terror cells, I believe, that are already well embedded within the nation. Electrical and water grids are the targets of choice, and it's all but impossible to defend the entire nation against such attacks, especially if attacked simultaneously. When almost everything in the nation, including what we just spoke about, financial and defense systems, are highly dependent upon electricity to function, it's not going to fare out well. I believe you no longer have to physically destroy a nation in order to destroy it functioning as a nation. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, certainly. I think you're right, Barry, in that it doesn't take a very large terrorist force to take out the key nodes in these infrastructures. And whether it's a cyber attack on the SCADA software that runs the utilities, and SCADA software is used for both the water utilities and the electrical and natural gas utilities. All three really are controlled by this software. SCADA stands for System Control and Data Acquisition. SCADA software is ubiquitous, and it's very vulnerable. And a lot of it was developed back in the 1950s and 1960s and just gradually kept being added to without security in mind, because they never really envisioned someone being able to access these systems via the internet. And most of these systems have internet backdoors. So we're vulnerable to cyber terrorism. We're vulnerable to physical terrorism, whether it's contaminating water supplies, municipal water supplies, for example. We're very vulnerable in terms of physical attacks on the power grids. All it takes is a high-power rifle and a typical power substation can be taken offline. You just poke enough holes in the transformers, and they'll be out of commission. In fact, there's even simpler attacks than that. There were attacks carried out by the Red Brigades in Italy back in the 1970s and 1980s that were not very well publicized in the United States. And one of their favorite tactics there was to ride up to power substations on stolen bicycles and simply throw the bicycles over the fence and short out the nodes on the top of the transformers. Now, our power infrastructure our water infrastructure, our natural gas infrastructure, and especially our liquid natural gas ports are extremely vulnerable to terrorism and essentially wide open. It's almost as if we're on the honor system here in this country, because usually all that stands between the terrorists and these infrastructures are chain link fences with little padlocks. I mean, come on. There really is no security. It's not like we're living with terrorism day in and day out like they are in the Western Sahara, and their entire society is geared toward protecting the infrastructure. It's a whole different mindset here in the United States, where we just assume the status quo, and we just assume that the greatest risk is the hacker mentality, where, you know, some kids decide to be mischievous.
It's kind of like almost an identical description of the Mexican Border Patrol, eh?